Welcome to part 4 in a biblical basics of political theology. Last video, we looked at the divine paradigm for adjudicating a crime or for retribution. We saw that God's rights had been violated, and he kind of sets the standard and the pattern for investigating and punishing. And we've already talked about the state being a post-fall institution. And that's important, right? So God alone has rights intrinsic to himself. His rights produce obligations in us, obligations to obey, to carry out the cultural mandate, to have families, to teach. There's these pre-fall spheres of family and society, a collection of families. The arts and the sciences and education, all of this is pre-fall, and we sometimes refer to that as pre-political. Man has these rights to obey God, to worship God in all these spheres. And then there is the fall. And so post-fall, we have these two institutions. We have a redemptive institution, the assembling of God's people. That was never needed pre-fall. Our covenantal brothers, want to say the church goes all the way back. That's fine, whatever. Point being, there is a redemptive institution that comes into being post-fall. There was no need for redemption prior to that. And then there's also a retributive institution, and that's what we call the state. It comes really post-fall as well. But there's already all of these pre-fall institutions. And this is important because now we're trying to examine the relationship between the post-fall institution of the state and all the pre-fall institutions. And so the question is, what is that relationship? Does this post-fall state have authority in all of these realms and spheres, or does it need to be triggered? Does the state's authority need to be triggered by some sort of a human rights violation claim? And that's the position I would take, a sphere sovereignty argument, in which all these different spheres are sovereign under the lordship of Christ, but the state their authority essentially is enacted or becomes active in a sphere when there is a rights violation or the claim of a rights violation. But before we go there, I think we already know that the job of the government, the state, is retributive. I think it's just helpful, though. 1 Peter chapter 2 does tell us, be subject for the sake of the Lord to every human institution, whether to a king or as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him. And note here, 2:14, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do good. This text here in 1 Peter seems to indicate the purpose, the teleology of civil government, the civil magistrate. Right? The praise of those who do good and the punishment of evildoers. And this is very, very similar to what Paul says in Romans 13, obviously the very famous text where Paul, Romans chapter 13, he says, verse 3, rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior. And we can get into that, and we'll get into that, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what's good. You'll have praise from the same, right? So the civil authority is to praise the good. But verse 4, for it's a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what's evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword in vain. For it is, now we have a purpose statement, a teleological statement. It is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil, and therefore it's necessary to be in subjection. So the picture in both 1 Peter and in Romans 13 is that the civil magistrate, the government, this post-fall institution, this retributive institution, is just that. It's retributive. That's its purpose. It is God's servant, and obviously there's a lot of implications there. What kind of servant doesn't acknowledge its master? But it is an avenger, and that's really key, right? It avenges. There first has to be a claim, and there first has to be an adjudication of such a claim, a violation of a human right, a civil right, or even God's rights. And so this is really important. We're at 4.5 minutes. Let's see if we can push this through pretty quick. Look at verse 6 of chapter 13 in Romans. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. This is a really helpful text in establishing the positive case for the role of civil government. So, because of what's been said, right, that it's an avenger, it brings wrath, God's wrath. And avenger goes back to Romans 12, where we're told not to avenge ourselves because vengeance is God. Now God says, this is how I carry out vengeance. And then in 13:6, this is why you pay taxes, because they're servants of God. So, follow the logic. It's proper for the civil government to collect taxes for some very specific purposes. That's the apostolic logic here. It's proper to collect taxes so that one can avenge God, to carry out the function of an avenger. Well, what does that look like? God's given us the divine paradigm in Genesis chapter 3. So first off, we're going to have taxes because there have to be people who are devoted to publishing the law. Now, granted, they are to punish evil. There's nothing in any of these texts about them defining evil. You see, evil's already been defined by the definer of good and evil, that is God. So the legislative body, the legislator, his job is not to define evil, it's to find the existing standard and then to publish that standard. We don't get to define that which is good and that which is evil, right? Woe to those who call good evil and evil good. No. So the first step is taxes are collected so that the magistrate can publish the laws. And then if there's going to be a punishing of the evildoer, we have to establish that there is in fact an evildoer. So we have God's standard of evil, it's published. Now there is a claim. And I think that is when the state's authority kicks in. There's been a claim. So now what has to happen to make sure we don't punish the good, but only punish the evil? There has to be an investigative arm, right? So it's proper to have taxes collected to create an investigative arm who can investigate claims. And so there's an investigation. Then you're going to need a judicial arm to try the claim, having gathered all of the evidence. So we have a legislative arm, we got an investigative arm, we got a judicial arm. This legislative arm publishes, the investigative arm investigates, the judicial arm tries the case, and then is going to pronounce judgment. And then you're going to have some sort of an arm that carries out that punishment. And so that's what we see in Genesis 3. That is the positive case for the scope of government. Now, outside of that, it also tells us that we're supposed to get praise from the same. So Romans 13:3, they're to praise us, and that's the same thing that Peter says in 1 Peter 2. And so the scope of the government, as it relates in Scripture, is it's to avenge God. It's the avenger of God's wrath when there is some sort of a civil rights or rights violation. And that's really important because we're trying to establish the relationship between the pre-political institutions and this pre-fall institutions and this post-fall institution. So hopefully that is helpful, and we'll pick this up with a little more development in the next video.